So this morning we're going to look at variables, constants, and data type. First, we're going to look at variables. So a variable basically is a pointer to an area of memory where we have data, right? As we know, in a computer system, data is stored in a binary format. So basically, data is stored in the form of zeros and ones, which is not easily understood by normal human beings. So we use variables basically to point to those areas in memory where we have a particular set of data stored. So a variable acts as a label for a data, right? All right, so let me just go ahead and use my browser and give you an example of what a variable is and how a variable is normally used in a computer system. So this time I'm going to use Chrome. So on my computer, I'll press F12. So let's see. Okay, and we get this tool. This is part of Chrome. And we're going to click on console. All right, so let's see a variable in action. So let's for example reference one of the problems that I think that we dealt with early on. That was find the sum of two integers, or basically two whole numbers, and then print the total. So find the sum of two numbers and then print the total. Right? So in that case, we would have used in our IPO table num1 to represent the first number. We would use num2 to represent the second number, right? And that would be under the inputs, because those would be the information that would be needed to be supplied to the computer system to do the calculation. And in terms of process, we would have num1 plus num2, right? And we would assign that value to the total. And in the output, we would have total, right? So in our IPO table, that's how we would have done it. So let's see how we would do it in while writing our actual program, right? So we're going to use the variable num1 and num2 because those would be the constructs that will actually hold the value in memory. So as we say, the variable, it points to the value in memory, right? So let's go ahead and give it a try. So in that case, we're going to say num1. So we're going to assign a value to num1. So num1. We can assign a value to it. So if num1, we say num1 equal, let's say 5. We enter. And let's add the value to num2. So num2, we assign a value to it. And let's put 6. All right. So we assign a value to num1 and num2. Now that would be part of our input. So let me just go ahead and clear it. So it's still stored in memory. So that means if I were to type num1 here, it should give me 5. If I type num2, it should give me 6, right? Because those values are now stored in memory. So they are stored in a memory location, and we now have a label to represent that number in memory. So we have num1 to represent the value of 5, and we have num2 to represent the value of 6. So so anywhere we use that keyword num1 or num2, we actually representing a value stored in memory, right? So that's what the variable is used for. Is to represent a value that is stored in memory. All right, so what can we do with a variable? All right, so seeing that we know what num1 and num2 is, we can now go ahead and say num1 plus num2, and we get the answer of 11, because num1 represents 5 and num2 represents 6, so the total will be 11, right? So if we had to create a program to represent what we had in the IPO table, that would be somewhat what we would have created, and that would be our answer there. All right, so the reason why it's called a variable, because it changes at runtime. So while processing, that value may change. For example, we could assign num1 to a different value. So we can assign num1 to 4, and if we run that calculations again, num1 plus num2, we have 10, because we now assign the value of 4 to num1, right? Now constants are a bit different, right? So so constants are variables, somewhat variables, because they point to data in memory, but the difference is that the value does not change during processing, right? And some values we could set up as constant would be something like pi, because we know what pi is a constant of 3.14, I believe, right? So for example, pi would be a constant, so that value would not change, so we label it as a constant. Later on, we'll see how we can actually assign constants in our programming language that we're going to be using, which will be Pascal. We're going to see how we can actually set our constants. The key thing about setting a constant is that whenever you set a constant, you cannot make a change to it. For example, num1 and num2, I could assign different values to it during runtime and get a different output. However, with a constant, the programming language won't allow you to set a value during runtime. So whatever value that you set, it's set initially, and it cannot be changed throughout the program, or else you get a error, a program error, right? You're gonna get an error if you try to change a constant. All right, so let's go on now to choosing a variable name. All right, so when choosing a variable name for your program, even while you're doing your IPO chart, you need to somewhat choose a variable name, a good variable name, as you go along, right? So there's some criteria you need to follow as to when choosing a variable name for your program. And one of the key things that you should bear in mind is that the variable name, it should reflect the data that is being stored in that label, right? So for example, if you are going to be storing the names of customers, a good variable name might be customer name, because it's sort of associated with what is being stored, right? If you're going to be storing maybe values from a total amount, you could probably give the name as total, right? Same thing if you're going to be storing the first names of students or first names, a good name for a variable would be first name, right? If you're going to be storing last names of individuals, what would be a good value? What would be a good name for that variable? Can you tell? Okay, so if you guessed last name, then you're correct, because you're going to be storing last name. So the label or the variable name should represent the data that is being stored in there, right? A next criteria or something that we should avoid is we should avoid using numbers before letters. Let's say, for example, you notice that our variable name was num1. We had num1, right? But we did not have one num as a variable name. We had num1. So in other words, You can add values or digits to your variable names, but they have to be after a letter. So they cannot start with a number. It must start with a letter. It could be uppercase, lowercase. It doesn't really matter, but it must start with a letter, and can follow by any amount of numbers. Right? So that's the second criteria. The next criteria is that we should have no spaces between variable name. And let me just go ahead and demonstrate right here. All right, so first let's try to assign a value to one num equal to, so you see we get an error. We get an error there if we try to assign a value to a variable name that starts with a number, right? So let's go ahead and clear that screen, and let's go ahead and try assigning a value to a variable that has a space. So let's go num space 1, and let's assign a value of 2 to it. Let's see what happens. So we have an error also, because we cannot add spaces in a variable name, right? And next important criteria is that we should not use reserved words as variables. So every program has a set of names that are considered to be reserved, and if you use those names, basically it will conflict with the program itself, because the program already has values assigned to those names. So we should avoid using it, and we also should find out what are some of the reserved words or the reserved variables in the program that we're using. So from program to program, the keywords or the reserved words may change, right? We're going to be using Pascal, and some of the keywords that you should not name your variable would be variables such as variable itself, the word variable, print, constant, if, end, pause, etc., etc. There's a whole list in your textbook that you could always reference, right? So there are quite a few names, but you can make up any name to name your variable. You can create your own name. You can be creative, right? Again, you should always stick to it reflecting the actual value that it's been stored. But other than that, you can actually be creative in your names, right? So you can do any name, no spaces, no numbers before, and no reserved words in your variable, right? So you could name it anything. You could name it anything. Anything is equal to 2, and that works. However, when we try it with the space, it didn't work. Okay. All right, the next thing that we're going to look at is data type. So if you all can remember, when we worked with database, we had different data types, and based on the information that was being stored in the database, we would have to change the data type. For example, if we were storing currency values, we would use currency as our data type. If we were storing strings of character, a name, and so on, we would use text, right? And if we were storing numbers, we would use the data type number. Well, same as Pascal, which is the programming language you're going to be using, right? A variable should be of a certain data type, right? So after you declare your variable and you assign your variable, your value to your variable, even before that, you should assign a data type, and we're going to look at that when we actually do the program implementation. But I just want you to know that a variable has to be of a certain type, and in our program, before we actually use the data, we actually have to tell our program what data type it should expect, right? So there are different types of data, or there are different data types, and we'll look at integer. So they are somewhat a little bit different from the database data types, right? Although some represent the same values. So we have integer. In database we had number. So but with programming now we have integer would represent any whole number. It could be positive or negative, right? So that would be integer. And we have real, which represents fractions, right? Whether negative or positive. And we have char, which holds a single character. So whether it's a space bar, whether it's a space character, or a question mark, a exclamation mark, a comma, all those are character by themselves. So that data type holds a single character. And then we have string. In database we would have text, right? But in programming we have string. Now a string holds a series of characters, or what we might call a word, right? So strings hold a series of characters like hello or hello world or John Brown, right? And then we have the next data type for holding values such as on, off, true, or false. They are called Boolean data type, right? So before you actually make use of your variable, you should already tell the program what data type would be stored, or what data would be stored, or what type of data would be stored in those variables, right? So for example, if you're going to be storing the names of users, which data type should you be using? String, right? So if you're going to be storing, let's say for example, you're going to do a calculation, the average student's mark, which data type would be best to hold that value? If you said real, then you're correct. All right. If we, let's say for example, want to get the first letter of a student name, so we want to store the first letter of a student name, what data type should we store it in? And if you said char, then you are correct, right? Okay, so that brings us to the end of data type and the end of our session for today. I hope that you all understand. Again, if you don't understand it, try to watch the video again, and if you have any questions again, feel free to let me know so I can further assist you.